Hello and welcome. Today we're going to examine how, by following delusional politicians and short-sighted energy consultants, Americans are now sleepwalking toward the end of the earth. Tweedledum is not Tweedledee. By now we have become accustomed to the Tweedledum factor in our political leadership. At least since the days of President Reagan and the Bushes, we have regularly become accustomed to hearing regularly from the administration's what the president said and what the president meant department. Often they'll say something in the morning, and by the afternoon, they mean something else, or at least we're told they meant something else. So yes, by now we understand that Tweedledum is not Tweedledee. Tweedledum in the morning is not what Tweedledee says in the afternoon. That's why we have experts, right? By the end of the day, we have come to expect, especially on the news programs, that some expert will be mobilized by the corporate media to contextualize, clarify, or otherwise explain away whatever our political leadership has said, by mistake, earlier in the day. This is what people like Danny Yergin have become very skilled in providing. He's a very good writer, and he's written for years on important topics, including the prize, and then later, the quest. By now, this is normal and well understood. But we are not used to the fact that the so-called experts or consultants can be misinformed and short-sighted, even when they've written another book about the topic. Daniel Yergin has just come up with a new one called The New Map: Energy, Climate, and the Clash of Nations. In fact, it's being promoted by the biggest bookstore in the world, owned by the richest person in the world, and Amazon promotes it in a little box saying these things are frequently bought together, no doubt just in time for thinking about Christmas presents and the like. We should ask the question, why is Amazon's promotional box being used in the first place to distribute this expertise? But let's in fact look at the more troubling question, which is, how can the experts be so dumb? The answer is that experts, who are all personally very smart, especially a fellow like Daniel Yergin, how can they become dumb? Well, they become dumb when they're expected to pronounce about topics beyond their expertise. This is often not their fault. They don't seek to speak on topics beyond their expertise, but they're often drawn into that by those who are interviewing them. There's no question that Daniel Yergin is an expert on energy. But what about climate? Is he an expert on climate? Was it his idea to include that in the title of the book? Or was it the publisher's idea? Realizing that climate and climate change has become a trendy topic, perhaps this is a way of selling more books. We don't know. Probably never know. The fact is that this can happen easily when experts become celebrities in cultures of consumption. Consider the logical traps we fall into in our culture of consumption. Experts are known for knowing a lot about something. Some experts become famous for their expertise. This is normal. A celebrity as someone who is known for being famous. But it does not follow that celebrities are therefore experts. Are they being asked to respond to questions on a news program because they are experts or because they're celebrities or because they fudge the line between the two? Let's have a look at how this works very subtly on our consciousness with a recent interview between Walter Isaacson of Amanpour and Company and Daniel Yergin.
The issues of fracking, emissions, and energy demand preoccupy our next guest. He's Daniel Yergin. He's a Pulitzer Prize-winning author and an energy expert, and he served as an advisor in the last 4 administrations. His latest book, The New Map, Energy, Climate, and the Clash of Nations, looks at just how it shapes America's position in the world. And here he is talking to our Walter Isaacson about all of this and the most promising new solutions out there.
Thank you, Christian, and Dan Jorgen, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Glad to be with you.
Before we get to the politics of the moment, explain to me what the shale oil revolution is all about and how it's impacted our country.
Walter, you are a student of entrepreneurs and stubborn people who make things happen. And the shale revolution is congruent with that understanding. There was one person in particular who was just convinced for 18 years that you could do this, and people thought it was crazy. He said, "You're wasting your money." He said, "It's my money." It was a public company, but he controlled it. And finally had a breakthrough in the period 1998 to 2003 is when it happened. And it really yoked together 2 technologies because petroleum textbooks had said this was impossible, that you couldn't get oil and gas out of this very dense rock called shale. It turns out you can. And then with this other technology, which depends upon advanced, computer capabilities, basically, you can drill horizontally 2 miles under the earth. Those 2 things are the technologies that brought shale together and turned this area of Texas and New Mexico called the Permian into the great rival of the largest oil field in Saudi Arabia.
You wrote a wonderful book called The Prize, which talked about America's dependence on oil. Suddenly things changed with the shale oil revolution. How has that created what you call the new map of energy?
It's turned things around 180 degrees, where the U.S. used to really worry about energy dependence, importing 60% of its oil. Today, the United States is the world's largest producer of oil, and that's changed economics, it's changed psychology, and it's had a big impact on international relations as well.
You talk about LNG, meaning liquefied natural gas. Does that help the United States export its newfound shale gas?
Well, certainly this is, our trade balance would be hundreds of billions of dollars higher, our imbalance rather, negative balance, were it not for the shift away from being an importer and indeed to becoming an exporter. And you can see in Asia, even with the tensions with China right now, China is a significant importer of energy from the United States. It's part of the trade deal that was negotiated at the end of last year.
This can happen, as we say, easily when experts become celebrities in cultures of consumption. But we have to ask ourselves, is the person a celebrity or an expert? Because not all celebrities are experts, certainly not in fields where they necessarily became famous in the first place. We should ask ourselves, was this an interview about the energy revolution or the shale revolution? In fact, it was about the shale revolution, not the energy revolution. What is the shale revolution? Well, according to Danny, it's the shift from one type of fossil carbon to another type of fossil carbon to supply our ever-growing energy demand. Is the shale revolution an energy revolution? Well, here's where it gets ambiguous. Often the two terms, especially by journalists, are used interchangeably. Shale revolution and energy revolution, meaning the same thing, but in fact they're quite different. The shale revolution is not an energy revolution, not from a climate perspective. We are still addicted to expanding carbon consumption. So there's no change here. There's continuity. In fact, the Isaacson-Jurgen interview provides a classic case study in the politics of distraction. This has been studied, the politics of distraction, by social scientists. In fact, years ago, in 2005, Weiskell wrote an article in November, exactly 15 years ago, on this whole problem. And it was based even on an earlier article, which he cited from England, not the United States, entitled How Mankind is Sleepwalking to the End of the Earth. It was by a famous journalist in Britain, Geoffrey Lean, and it was published in February of 2005, full 9 months before the American article came out citing it. Even 15 years ago, the question was put why Americans are sleepwalking toward the end of the world, toward the end of the earth at the time. Well, it appeared in the American behavioral scientists, and it's important to look at that in a way because the behavioral scientists are scientists, but not necessarily focused on numerical sciences, but on the qualitative sciences of sociology and ethnography. Social scientists have understood for a long time what motivates the behavior across all cultures. This is what anthropologists spend a lot of time doing, looking at something that appears in one culture and then its manifestations and variations in all cultures. It turns out that in times of crisis, it's not our knowledge systems, but rather our belief systems that control our behavior.
Belief systems?
Well, I think the problem is that most of us in academia, and in fact in political parties, are arguing back and forth on the basis of knowledge systems, what we know. We're trying to we come in with wheelbarrows full of evidence, and sort of try to stack it up in some sense. And the trouble is that people don't behave on what they know. They behave on the basis of what they believe. And what they believe is quite different from what they know, especially when they're under stress. Now, this is not unique to America. It's not unique to elective democracies. It's not unique to Western industrial nations. It's not unique to any known civilization. It's a common pattern. People, when under stress, act on beliefs, not on knowledge. How can you get to a new set of beliefs? Don't bother worrying about whether you're going to get the right guy elected or not. The question is whether the premise of the election is going to move in the right direction. And that's, it seems to me, very hard to do. Not a cheerleading proposition. It has to do with the question, do we have the power to change our minds? In fact, it's not a trivial issue. Many of our biggest heroes in this country have sustained themselves and brought themselves to power on imagery that's totally nonsensical, including the new frontier. Remember Kennedy's big notion that we're going to have a new frontier and we're going to go off to the moon. Well, we got a guy now who's way beyond the moon and wanting to weaponize space in some sense. This notion of a linear progress off a sphere makes no sense. There's no such thing as a linear transition off a sphere, right? The basic metaphor is wrong. The idea in economics of continuous growth on a finite planet makes no sense. Try to change the minds of people in power on the issue of growth economics. Find a candidate who will stand up and say, vote for me I can promise you no growth, right? You laugh at it because it's laughable. We've grown up in a culture that thinks exponential growth is normal. It's not, and it won't be. Can't happen, won't happen. You need some sober talk from people like 15-year-old Swedish schoolgirls to say, listen, we're in this way beyond the institutions we've inherited or could possibly create. We've got to learn languages fast. And we've got to learn that, yes, we've got a racial problem on Earth. It's the human race. We've got to start embracing each other fast.
So, in times of crisis, we need to remember that it's our knowledge systems that take the second seat to our belief systems. It's our belief systems that control our behavior in times of crisis. Crucial to understand 2 days before an election. We need to take a look at how our culture needs to make a transition in our beliefs and behavior. And for this reason, transition studies are now becoming crucial for human survival. This evening, we want to look a little bit more at what the new voices are around the world that are, in effect, reacting to the fossil fuel suicide of industrial civilization. There are a group, and they're emerging around the world with a new kind of consensus, in a sense that points to the fact that we have to get beyond fossil fuels. A lot of the statements of the scientists have been foundational in this regard, and it is true that they've been out in front, way out in front of most of the public. But that's not the case anymore, because people are seeing fracking in their backyard, they're seeing their own water supply being intruded upon, they're having doubts about the Middle East and the whole question about sustainability of extraction in other places around the world. And there have been triumphant statements about the need to move to transition studies everywhere from local school systems right through the high schools, the colleges and universities. In fact, you can see it's pretty pronounced almost everywhere these days. Take a look. We're a fossil fuel dependent civilization, independent of what nationality we are. Our modern civilization is dependent on fossil fuels. We have to get to being a solar sustainable system. You'll admit, there's a bit of a transition, right? Transition studies are what's now in every discipline, every department, every university. Well, they may be in some intellectual sense, but it's hardly an entire movement at this point. So we have a long ways to go in understanding and moving toward a system of, in effect, sustainable, just economies based on solar sustainability. It'll have to be the case. In other words, you can't outlast your life support system. And what we're beginning to realize is that although we're coming up with new forms of extracting fossilized fuel, we're not producing fossil fuel. We're extracting it, we're transporting it, we're refining it, and guess what? We're burning it. That is to say, we're oxidizing all forms of terrestrial carbon, whether it's coal, natural gas, or petroleum. The end product of that is that you're taking terrestrial carbon and converting it to atmospheric carbon. CO2 or methane or one of the other compounds that ends up in the atmosphere, because we've been using the atmosphere as a kind of sink. The trouble with that is that it's suicidal. There is nobody, no institution that can outlive its own life supplies, and that's where we're in trouble, because its life support system depends not just upon the oil that it can get, but the whole environment in which it lives.
And that's what we need to spend a little time understanding as a group, as a collective group in a sense. It's been pointed out again and again by a whole series of scientists, so it's not new. And what we need to do is, in a sense, connect the dots. One of the most prominent scientists to point this out has been Noam Chomsky over the years, and it's worth listening to what he has to say on this, because it's really quite extraordinary and still not absorbed. He's been saying it for decades. It's worth looking at, though.
The Chamber of Commerce, the main business lobby, the American petroleum industry, other business lobbies have publicly proclaimed, in fact with enthusiasm, that they are carrying out a campaign to try to convince the population that global warming is a liberal hoax. And it's succeeded, unfortunately. The latest polls I've seen show maybe a third of the population believes in anthropogenic global warming. The media contribute in their own way. So, for example, when the New York Times runs a front-page article on what meteorologists think about global warming, namely, they don't believe it. Meteorologists are pretty faces who read scripts telling you if it's going to rain tomorrow. What do they have to say any more than your barber? But that's presented as if it's a significant contribution to the discussion.
Right. Presented as if it's a significant contribution to a scientific discussion. Why? Because a weatherman was telling me. The weatherman, in fact the Weather Channel, was owned by a climate denier until he died recently, and it's really quite significant. Whether, in effect, any kind of news media, given the for and against character of news presentation, usually one anchor here, Tweedledee and Tweedledum over here, and they go back and forth, is it this or is it that? Is it this or is it that? Never looking beyond the false dichotomies that they put forward. This is problematic because we need to, in effect, learn how to count at least to three, right? It's not just one side and the other side. What about the third side? This is something Chomsky has been putting out there for years and pointing out to us. The world has underestimated climate change. The experts point out now, because it's not either for climate change or against climate change, it's the question of how fast is it occurring. And there is dispute there. This isn't over as a debate, but the dispute has to do with the rate and pace of change, not whether it's occurring. And what we're beginning to see is that back in 2011, we already realized that the warming sheets of ice meant that we're basically going to see melting in Greenland and Antarctica, and that we finally have gotten around to measuring that. Sea levels rise from polar ice melt finally quantified, according to a 2012 article by David Schuckman. Well, it was known before that, but it's irrefutably quantified for the last 6 years, right? Well, take a look at that, because that was the end of 2012, and we still have climate deniers here. Take a look at how Chomsky characterizes them.
But what's rather interesting about this, and tells you something about the nature of our society, is that those same CEOs and managers who are trying to convince the public that it's a liberal hoax know perfectly well that it's extremely dangerous. They have the same beliefs that you and I have. So they're caught in a kind of an institutional contradiction. As leaders of major corporations, they have an institutional role. That is to maximize short-term profit. And if they don't do that, they're out and someone else is in who does do it. So it's, basically, institutionally speaking, it's not a choice. That's going to happen in the major institutions. So they may know that they're mortgaging the future of their grandchildren, and in fact, maybe everything they own will be destroyed, but They're caught in a trap of institutional structure. That's what happens in market systems. The financial crisis is a small example of the same thing. You may know that what you're doing carries systemic risk, but you can't calculate that into your transactions, or you're not fulfilling your role and somebody else replaces you. In fact, in the United States, it's actually a legal obligation to do that for corporate executives.
So, that's the institutional contradiction. CEOs have a legal obligation, a fiduciary responsibility to maximize profit for their shareholders. So they know that this global warming is catastrophic. They're not dumb. They can read. They understand the scientists understand this. But they're caught in an institutional contradiction, according to the formulation of Chomsky. And that institutional contradiction is pretty staggering. They can't afford to do anything less than maximum return, or they're ousted as the CEO. Staggering implications here.
So, and that's a very serious problem. It means that we're marching over the cliff and doing it for institutional reasons that are pretty hard to dismantle.
We're marching over the cliff for reasons that are pretty hard to dismantle. That's a characteristic Chomsky understatement. Read impossible institutionally to dismantle. People in these institutional roles, whether they're President Faust over at Harvard or the President of the United States, Obama, when he was in the presidency, knew the science. He had the best science advisor available in the English-speaking world. John Holdren was telling him to get serious about this. But he had an institutional role to grow the economy. And he waffled. He waffled on the pipeline and ultimately started saying different things to different people and had an energy policy, you'll remember it from his famous State of the Union, of all of the above. Right? Let's do all of the above. Complete collapse of responsibility in reference to a contradiction that's built into the system. This isn't just because he's a weak-minded person. It's built into the institutional structure of the system. Now, where does that leave us? Take a look.
There's other factors like the anger and fear and hostility in the country about everything carries over to this. So if you look at polls, everyone hates Congress, they hate the Democrats, they hate the Republicans even more, they hate big business, they hate banks, and they distrust scientists. So why should we believe what these pointy-headed elitists are telling us? We don't trust anything else, we don't trust them. All of this combines. The latest election a couple of days ago is you can almost interpret it as a kind of a death knell for the species. There was an article in Bloomberg Business Week, not a radical rag exactly, running through the new Republicans coming to Congress, and they're worried about them. One of the reasons is because they're global warming deniers, almost all. That means the powerful House committees are like science and technology and so on are going in the hands of people who think there's nothing to it, or at least claim that they think that. What they actually think is another story. In fact, one of them was quoted as saying, "Can't be a problem because God will take care of it." Now, if this was happening in some small country, and maybe I don't know what, Monaco or something, it wouldn't matter much. But when it's happening in the richest, most powerful country in the world, it's a danger to the survival of the species. Nobody else is going to do very much if the United States doesn't do a lot, not just some, but take the lead. So we're essentially saying, let's kiss each other goodbye.
So we're essentially saying, let's kiss each other goodbye. Now this is a pretty sober assessment of the institutional contradictions at the core of what we're facing.
Now, if this was happening in some small country, and maybe I don't know what, Monaco or something, it wouldn't matter much. But when it's happening in the richest, most powerful country in the world, it's a danger to the survival of the species. Nobody else is going to do very much if the United States doesn't do a lot, not just some, but take the lead. So we're essentially saying, let's kiss each other goodbye.
Well, that's the sober assessment. We're marching off the cliff, according to Noam Chomsky. This is back in 2011, right? He's been making this statement for quite a while now to the world, and he's dismissed. He's not even written up in most of the mainstream media. Things like Truth Out carry his op-ed statements, but we need to look at the whole question of metrics of our success. We're looking for technological breakthroughs in efficiency, not change in direction. And that's going to be suicidal. In short, we're looking for, and our culture is rewarding, the wrong thing. We're not likely to find the right thing if we're looking for the wrong thing. It's no wonder, really, that we cannot help but be disappointed. We're looking for wizards, and we should be listening to the prophets. The Rhodes Scholars get together every once in a while, and they're almost as pompous as Harvard University and the other universities in the area, but at least every once in a while the question is posed. In one of their gatherings, they had a discussion of climate change and looked.
So we are running close to the end, and I'll let's go over by a few minutes just to squeeze in a few questions, try to keep them short. Gentleman at the front.
Tim Marshall Bailey, 69. I'm curious if any of you on the panel, or in fact those of you in the room, are nervous about the underlying metaphors we've been using today, because in effect we're sliding into vocabulary that gets us nowhere fast. We're looking at things like, I think you used the phrase green growth, for example. It's now coming into the vocabulary of sustainable growth, as if that's possible, that kind of oxymoron. Or nuclear safety, probably not. Or business ethics, or for that matter, military intelligence. I mean, we seem to accept terminology that is absolutely incoherent. And green consumerism is not going to get us there. Why? Well, because it's to the consumerism that's driving the problem. Now, whether or not we get more efficient at it is very amply demonstrated by Dan. I mean, you can't get a better person at getting better delivery of services, bang for the buck, whatever you want to use. But at some point, he's not inviting people to self-impose self-restraint. He's delivering more energy to them more cheaply. And in a culture that's dominated by consumerism, all that's going to do is hasten and make more efficient extinction.
Hasten and make more efficient extinction. All our wizards are involved in trying to make extinction more efficient, not in trying to avoid it. It's the prophets who are saying, listen, down that route there's no future. It's people like, in effect, the humanities that have made this very clear. In response, the Rhodes Scholar from South Africa came as a member of the panel to respond to the statement. Kumi Naidu.
But I didn't have a chance to answer that last question. And I do want to say that, folks, if there's one question I appeal to you that you take away from today's session, take away that question. Because that question is actually, in a very honest way, posing the contradiction that we find ourselves. And when I said our leaders are in denial and we're suffering from cognitive dissonance, they're not willing to address this question. Because the bottom line is, if we are to deliver not to the additional 2 billion people that will be born in the next coming decades, but just to the 7 billion people that live on this planet, what all of us in this room take for granted, right, in terms of material consumption. According to our friends at WWF, we would need as much as 3 to 8 more planets, right? Right? So just think about that, right? Because we, and the one thing that I would say, Dan's absolutely right about how difficult it is to work with people's expectations on consumption. But let's not be, let's also ask ourselves, how did people get to that point of expectation, right? It didn't just happen. And I refer you to a book by a US sociologist called Benjamin Barber called Consumed, with the subtitle, How the Advertising Industry Infantilizes Adults and, infantilizes adults, life, anti-aging and all of that, and corrupts the young. Because don't understand, consumption patterns are actually manufactured, and we need to look at those that actually create those amounts. The bottom line is, if we think we can actually secure the future of our children by averting catastrophic climate change without addressing the excessive consumption, particularly in the developed countries of the world, and particularly, by the way, by the elites in developing countries, because I can tell you the worst consumption patterns we find is actually the elites in developing countries. And sadly, in my own country now, some really good examples that I can show you, but I'd rather not because I don't want to be depressed.
All right, well,
Well, you can see the issue here is really quite staggering, and the road scholars, when they get around to looking at it, in effect, start to exchange things on an international level about the vulnerabilities of the entire industrial civilization with its elite structures in the third world as well. The point that many should have been recognizing a long time ago is made by humanists often more clearly than by the scientists. Basically, you can ask, well, who needs the liberal arts anymore? Because in higher education, shouldn't we be training more and more wizards to come up with more and more efficient ways of doing things? Well, the liberal arts reads poetry about had we but world enough and time, and then thinks about other dimensions. But we ought to take a look at one key person who put it very clearly, and we'd all learn from his ability from the liberal arts to connect the dots. Take a look.
Caution. It is vitally important not to make connections. When you see the shots of rubble from Joplin, Missouri, you should not wonder, is this somehow related to the tornado outbreak 3 weeks before it in Tuscaloosa, Alabama? Or the enormous outbreak a couple weeks before that, which together comprised the most active April for tornadoes in U.S. history? No, that doesn't mean anything. It is far better to think of these as isolated, unpredictable, discrete events. It is not advisable to try to connect them in your mind with, say, the fires burning across Texas. Fires that have burned more of America at this point this year than any wildfires have in previous years. Texas and adjoining parts of Oklahoma and New Mexico are drier than they've ever been. The drought is worse than that of the Dust Bowl, but do not wonder if they're somehow connected. If you did wonder, you see, you would also have to wonder about whether this year's record snowfalls and rainfalls across the Midwest, resulting in record flooding along the Mississippi, could somehow be related. And then you might find your thoughts wandering to, global warming, and to the fact that climatologists have been predicting for years that as we flood the atmosphere with carbon, we will also start both drying and flooding the planet, since warm air holds more water vapor than cold air. It's far smarter to repeat to yourself the comforting mantra that no single weather event can ever be directly tied to climate change. There have been tornadoes before, and floods. That's the important thing. Just be careful to make sure you don't let yourself wonder why all of these record-breaking events are happening in such proximity. That is, why there have been unprecedented mega-floods in Australia, New Zealand, and Pakistan in the past year. Why it's just now that the Arctic has melted for the first time in thousands of years. No, better to focus on the immediate causalities. Watch the videotape from the store cameras as the shelves are blown over. Look at the news anchor man standing in his waders in the rising river as the water approaches his chest. Because if you asked yourself what it meant that the Amazon has just come through its second 100-year drought in the past 5 years, or that the pine forests across the western part of this continent have been obliterated by a beetle in the past decade, well, you might have to ask yourself other questions, such as, should President Obama really have just opened a huge swath of Wyoming to new coal mining? Should Secretary of State Hillary Clinton sign a permit this year allowing a huge new pipeline to carry oil from the tar sands of Alberta? You might also have to ask yourself, do we have a bigger problem than $4 a gallon gasoline?
Right. You might have to ask yourself, do we have a bigger problem than $4 a gallon gasoline? We sure do. But none of the energy people are going to tell you that, because they claim to be able to produce energy, and now we're finding out they're claiming they can produce it more cheaply, more efficiently. Does that get us off our dependence on energy? Not a bit, not a bit, because in effect we're all becoming more and more dependent on something that's becoming cheaper and cheaper. This doesn't avert extinction, it accelerates extinction. So all of the revolutionary material here that we've heard about in the climate revolution having to do with fracking and what's now being called, in effect, an act of God, or who we might call it that in a way, but it's thanks to God is the way the Texas people have put it themselves. It's actually pretty interesting to go back and listen to their assertions about it, because it's not something that trips off the tongue of many people in urban circumstances, but the description of it does from people who have that perspective from Texas. Let's take a look.
In recent years, a silent revolution has taken place. We thought the age of fossil fuels was coming to an end, and we hoped we were heading for a future filled with renewable energy. But in Texas, deep in the heart of the old oil industry, a handful of men have caused a dramatic shift, putting the United States firmly back on the map as an oil and gas producing superpower.
This breakthrough on shale turned out to be the biggest energy innovation so far of the 21st century.
Thanks to the shale revolution, and with President Trump at the helm, the United States is headed straight for total energy independence.
President Trump will fuel America's future and become the first president to achieve American energy independence.
The shale revolution has opened up a huge reservoir of fossil energy.
I'll say this, wherever there's oil fields, there's shale somewhere nearby that have not been drilled, and that's all over the world.
But what exactly does the shale revolution entail?
We shouldn't be exploiting any more fossil fuel gas because it's ruining our planet.
This is Backlight. Welcome to Trumpland.
Can I have everybody's attention?
The whole world is keeping close tabs on the state, where a few men in Texas are turning the energy supply industry on its head.
Can I have everyone's attention? It might be worth saying a few things about what Mitchell did and how it has impacted the world.
Dan Stewart was a team leader with Mitchell Energy, a small gas company that unleashed the shale revolution in the late 1990s. Once a year, the team gets together to celebrate their success at extracting gas from the Barnett Shale rock formation in northern Texas.
Mitchell started the Barnett looking for something to save the company, because we knew that our shallow reserves were decreasing, and if we didn't have something to replace it, we were not going to keep building reserves.
Over half the oil that has been produced in the whole world was produced in the United States, mainly in the states of Texas, California.
It looked as if the heyday of the US as an energy-producing superpower had come to an end. In the previous few decades, America had become known chiefly as the biggest consumer of fossil energy.
America is addicted to oil.
The country had become more and more dependent on foreign oil and gas. On several occasions, this led to costly and radical military intervention, the consequences of which are still to be seen.
If we hadn't proven the Barnett when we did, the price of natural gas would have gotten up to probably $20 an MCF and would have destroyed our economy.
The production of oil and gas in the US was dropping fast. George Mitchell was one of the many who needed to rescue their business. He had to find a new way of extracting gas and believed shale could be the way to go.
So what Mitchell started turned into a world-changing supply of energy. And in my opinion, it was a gift from God.
Well, in his opinion, it was a gift from God. Why? Because it extends the period of fossil fuel dominance in our culture. As he says, it was a world-changing supply of energy, a gift from God. But it's not at all clear it's a gift from God, especially if it increases the dependence upon cheap fossil fuels. There is the question of pollution of the groundwater and air in the immediate area, but there's something even more fundamental at work here that needs to be examined. Dan explains it actually. Take a look.
We glutted the gas market first, then we glutted the oil market to the point that we interfered with OPEC's profits. When we interfered with OPEC's profits, they said, well, we gotta shut this down. We were taking away some of their customers. So they decided they had to basically go to war with U.S. operators for survival's sake. And so they started pumping out a lot more oil and dropping the price.
The idea was shale production, shale oil production is very expensive. U.S. producers will not be able to drill any wells at these prices. Production declines very quickly out of these fields, and therefore all we have to do is wait around a couple years. We can outlast the U.S. producers. They're gonna suffer. Prices then will come back up because U.S. shale production will drop, and it didn't happen.
For the industry, there's a pro and there's a con, okay? The con is, yes, a lot of people lost jobs, and I hate that. I hate that. A lot of companies went bankrupt. I hate that. But our country gained from this because the companies that didn't go out of business figured out cheaper ways to get more reserves in order to combat the lower OPEC price.
Okay, you can't get a more clear explanation than that. We found out cheaper ways to extract more oil and outcompete the Saudis, who decided not to support the price but to let it keep falling. So the world price of carbon has come down, driving in effect other forms of energy generation out of business, including solar and the renewables. Take a look at the way it's perceived as a victory rather than a big wrong turn.
It's gotten cheaper. We're getting more oil out of the wells for less cost. And so that's where we're at. 10 years from now, I don't know. Maybe we'll be able to produce it at $30 a barrel. Everybody in the U.S. It just depends on how much we can recover and how good we get at that recovery. But it's a tremendous thing for the United States of America to have this play. It's changed the whole political structure of the world. What's happening right here.
The addition of U.S. shale has certainly shifted away from an OPEC-dominated world oil market to a much more competitive oil market, and that's been driven by this amazing increase in U.S. production. I think it's now recognized that it's part of the mix. I think it's also recognized that it's not high-cost oil, it's medium-cost oil, and there are other oil supplies that are higher cost around the world. And so it's a recognition that shale is going to be part of the mix. It's not going away.
Now, one of the big questions we have about who would want to come and visit here. Well, from all over the world, from China, Japan, South America, Middle East, all over Europe. You name the country in the last 3 years, they visited in here to see what this is all about. And do they have the potential for it? I'll say this, wherever there's oil fields, there's shales somewhere nearby that have not been drilled. And that's all over the world. So we see a really big future for shale being able to deliver oil and gas. So all the Middle East oil fields are conventional sands and limestones that produce oil. Guess what's underneath those gigantic oil fields in Saudi Arabia? Shales that have never been drilled.
Okay, you get the impression here, you get the idea. There's far more out there underneath those oil fields that have never been tapped with this new technology. Shales. Fantastic news. Everyone's going to get in on it. They've all been going down to Texas to look at the technology and learn about it themselves, and I'm sure Texas is willing to sell it, licensing and the like at a price. And America has now emerged to being an exporter of fossil fuels to the Middle East. This is an extraordinary revolution, and exactly in the wrong direction. We're going 90 miles an hour at 180 degrees the wrong way, and we haven't realized that at the end of the street, we're running into a dead end. In fact, we're going off a ski jump at an accelerated rate. Really quite extraordinary. The myopia, complete myopia of some of the most intelligent individuals in America. People like Danny Bergen, who was among the first of his class when he graduated in 1968, along with George Bush from Yale.
That are untapped, that will be decades and decades of potential production into the future.
Now, here's the very interesting slip-up in the logic. Decades and decades of potential production. What he means, obviously, is extraction. Nobody in any of the fossil fuel companies, in any of the fossil fuel nations of the world have ever produced a single drop of oil. They don't produce it. It was produced about 300 million years ago by biogeochemical processes and, in effect, sequestered beneath the Earth's surface. Not producing a thing, they're releasing it. They're making it available, accessible, refining it, delivering it to those who wish to what? Oxidize it, combust it, get the energy out of it by burning it. And he's celebrating that as a good idea, when we already know we can't live in the world whose atmosphere is the sink into which all of that oxidized carbon is placed. It's staggering.
Shale gas and oil has introduced even more fossil fuels onto our energy market. This abundance of cheap fossil fuels now threatens to price renewable energy out of the market. Many people wonder how it will affect our efforts towards a sustainable future.
Well, take a guess. how it's likely to, in effect, affect the movement to a sustainable future. We have no sustainable future if we're undercut by an abundance of even more cheap fossil fuels, keeping alive the illusion of economies of infinite growth on a finite planet. It can't happen, it won't happen. But the crash is going to be ever more dramatic the longer we choose to ignore the problem. And we've chosen to ignore the problem in a big way, really quite staggering way in a sense. I mean, what we need to do is start to get sober about some of this stuff and realize the basic physics underneath it. In other words, what are we looking at here in terms of how the biogeochemical systems of the Earth work, and what can we survive with and without? Let's take a look. I mean, it's really quite staggering.
Shale gas and oil has introduced even more fossil fuels onto our energy market. This abundance of cheap fossil fuels now threatens to price renewable energy out of the market. Many people wonder how it will affect our efforts towards a sustainable future.
What in the United States, what low-cost gas has done is really pushed coal and taken market share away from coal. Coal used to be more than 50% of electric generation not so long ago. Now it's under 30%, and gas actually has a bigger share. So, I think there's a long-term energy transition happening. I think it's going to unfold over many decades, not over many years, but renewables will become progressively more important. I think natural gas plays a particularly important role as a partner of renewables because renewables are intermittent. The classic thing is the sun doesn't shine all the time, the wind doesn't blow all the time, and so gas is an important part of the mix.
Shale gas as the ideal partner for renewable energy. That's one way of looking at it, according to the Americans. And as they now have an abundance of gas thanks to the shale revolution, they present themselves as the new energy superpower on the world stage.
You got to get the intellectual gymnastics that's been achieved there by this brilliant Danny Yergin. He's calling it a partner with renewables. A partner with renewables. Some people call it a bridge fuel, right? A bridge, well, it's not a bridge to less dependence on fuel. It's just a shift from one form of carbon, coal, perhaps dirtier, to natural gas, perhaps cleaner. Yes, at the point of burning, it is cleaner, but not at the point of extraction, at the point of leakage, at the point at which methane is being, in effect, spilled into the atmosphere on a scale never previously seen in Earth's history. It's really quite extraordinary to think of it as a partner with renewable energy. But he does. I mean, it's quite, as I say, the intellectual gymnastics on the part of those who are making money off of this bonanza is absolutely staggering. They have convinced themselves that they're, for the first thing, producing fossil fuels when they aren't. Secondly, that the more efficient ones will help us become less dependent on fossil fuels. On the contrary, they build in a greater and greater dependence, as any person who knows about addiction realizes. If you lower the cost of drugs, people can take more of them at the same price.
This facility started with the idea that the U.S. was going to be short of gas. And so the decision was made to build an import facility. So we built the import facility. It was started up in 2008, 2009, right when the shale revolution started. And so since then, the facility hadn't operated. And as the shale revolution kicked off in 2010, we actually announced that we were going to export gas. And so we undertook building the export facility that you see behind me.
So there actually was
a facility to import gas to the United States.
Correct. And now what we've done is we've turned it around to export gas to the rest of the world from the United States.
In terms of oil, it's very similar that the U.S., in just a period of a little more than half a decade, almost doubled its oil production, and people started saying that the U.S. was going to overtake Russia and Saudi Arabia to be the largest producer of oil in the world. And now when you think of world oil, you have to think of the big three: Saudi Arabia, Russia, and the United States.
Our cargoes have been exported all over the world. South America, Southeast Asia, Europe, the Middle East.
How come the Middle East needs to use shale gas?
They're actually building import terminals in several countries in the Middle East, and so, you know, our production and our price matches up with their needs.
But isn't it ironic that the U.S. is exporting gas to the Middle East?
Yes, it is actually. This month, the U.S. has actually become a net exporter of energy due to the fact that we've had the shale revolution and we're able to export LNG.
Okay, we've had the shale revolution and we're able to export liquid natural gas, LNG. Well, so much for getting off of fossil fuels. We're nowhere near it. Take a look, I mean, it's staggering.
The first imports of U.S. oil from the Middle East was from Kuwait in around 1948. And now it's just a turnaround. The U.S. will actually be among the exporters of natural gas to Kuwait.
Danny can hardly conceal his enthusiasm about this, his excitement. Well, he realizes that, yeah, energy companies, to which he gives a great deal of consultation, are going to make big bonanza bucks off of this, right? But he hasn't stepped back to ask whether we can get beyond fossil fuels. He hasn't connected the dots, as Bill McKibben has pointed out we need to do.
And that, you know, if you sort of think about it, it really shocks the mind.
What shocks the mind is, if you think about it, that an energy expert like this can have no understanding of the climate impact of methane. Yes, it's going to become cheaper, right? It's going to make a few firms a lot of money. It's going to revive the United States posture in the fossil fuel extraction business, not production, extraction business. But where's the analytical capability of very intelligent people like Danny when it comes to looking at system-wide sustainability? It's a great illustration of what Chomsky pointed out. If you're concerned about system questions, you get ousted as a CEO. You can't calculate systemic risk into return of your corporation. Absolutely staggering example.
What does this mean for the old school oil producers? The main oil exporting countries are increasingly worried about the United States as an energy superpower.
We're still seeing the unfolding geopolitical impact of the shale revolution. Middle East countries express concern that the U.S. will be less interested in the Middle East because it will be importing a lot less oil. And I think that there's a sense that this enhances the autonomy and the position of the U.S.
The fact that we are less dependent on foreign oil is great for the United States. You know, we were importing probably 60%, maybe a little more than that. Now we're only importing less than half. And we have the potential to further reduce that. And you know, I don't know if the United States will be energy independent, But certainly North America could be energy independent with the Canadians and the Mexicans. That whole region, we could produce what we use.
This may well be behind Trump's calculations about renegotiating NAFTA, right? The North American Free Trade Agreement, Mexico, Canada, the United States. Oh, we can renegotiate that now because we can become more powerful as a producer in quotes, an extractor of fossil fuels. If we came up with the biggest reserves available on the planet, the tar sands in Canada, well, there'd be no stopping us whatsoever. And who knows? With ideologues like Danny Yergin, there'd be no opposition to this.
I think the shale revolution and its impact on prices has not only hit the budgets of oil exporting countries, of petrostates, but has also hit the very conception of how these states work and their overdependence on oil revenues, and the fact that they set their budgets at high prices and expenditures and then they have to cut them. And I think what it's done, it's sent a very powerful message about diversifying economies.
Well, it sent a powerful message by getting different sources into your economy, but it hasn't penetrated even Danny's consciousness that what you've got to do is get off fossil fuels, diversify to the extent of getting away from dependence upon non-renewables. He's a very clever guy. He's not stupid. He's just extraordinarily myopic in his cleverness, making, therefore, extinction, not just for him and for the companies that he advises, but for the entire shooting match, the entire global ecosystem, something that will become more and more rapid as the deterioration of the environment becomes more and more pronounced in extreme weather, droughts, floods, famines, migrations, disease outbreaks, and sea level rise.
And managing your oil revenues differently so you're not vulnerable to cycles. Because I think the oil exporting countries became accustomed to high prices.
To high prices and high swimming pools, right? Here you have a swimming pool on top, pretty extraordinary, on top
Became
of the building. Became accustomed to a swimming pool on top of a multi-story building. An architectural monument to stupidity. But we have the edifice being constructed by people like Danny Yergin, who see no irony in developing more and more extraction technologies to increase our dependence on non-renewables.
To high prices and assume the high prices would go on forever, and they base their budgets and spending on that, and then reality delivered a very powerful shock with which they're still dealing.
In Saudi Arabia, they have oil. That's their economy, and it supports their whole nation. In America, in the United States, we have lots of economies, okay? And they all support, so we're diversified. That's a good thing. That's a good thing for your country, because now you have two sources for gas. So if you just have one, that guy's in total control, right? He's not in total control anymore. That's a good thing. That's a good thing for your country. You're not totally dependent on Putin now, right? If we can export to you, then he's going to try to come to the table and say, hey, I'm not going to really cut that gas off this winter like I did before, because I know you can get it from the U.S.
From Europe's point of view, to have competition between Russian gas and U.S. natural gas, first of all, is valuable from an economic point of view because it means more competition, but it's also valuable because it gives diversification of resources, and that gives resilience to the energy system.
This is an extraordinary acrobatic achievement, intellectually speaking. it gives resilience to the energy system. Why? Well, because now we have different sources of carbon. Is it resilient in the sense of getting beyond carbon? Not really. Yes, the US can be held as a competitor against Putin's supply of natural gas to Europe, and therefore they can bargain for a little better price. But are they bargaining for something that's outside of the realm of fossil fuels? No. They're just bargaining for a lower price, and they're getting it because the competition is driving the price down. Therefore, they don't have to convert their economies to solar sustainable, the only survivable strategy in the long run. When Danny Yergin talks about diversify, he means diversify within the fossil fuel sphere.
Particularly at a time when Europe's own gas, preeminently from Groningen among others, is going down, Europe's going to need to import more gas, and it's wise to import it from a number of different suppliers.
Europe's going to need to import more gas. Well, maybe, if that's the direction.
The gas reserves in the Netherlands are diminishing fast. Shale gas seemed a good solution, but it is met with a lot of resistance.
Ja, nou het is net als ze ons door de strot willen duwen. Dat gevoel heb ik er nu bij. Die bodemgesteldheid is hier geweldig en die laten we niet verpesten door een paar jaar van die schaliegasboringen hier toe te staan.
Ja, maar als we nu zeggen Groningen niet en we willen geen schaliegas en we willen Russisch gas niet en we willen Noordzeegas niet, waar moet ik het gas dan vandaan halen?
The Dutch government has decided to ban shale drilling for now. In the United Kingdom, however, they think it has great possibilities. Various companies are trying to convince people that it's the path to follow. Ineos is one of these British companies. They hired the Texan pioneers as consultants, hoping to copy America's success in the UK.
Beneath the surface of the United Kingdom lie huge shale gas deposits. The British government thinks this gas could transform UK industry, making the country energy independent and creating tens of thousands of new jobs in manufacturing.
The British government wants to develop shale, not only because it needs additional natural gas, but also because it sees the economic benefits for its industry, for its competitiveness, for job creation. But it's run into a lot of environmental opposition, and so not much has happened in the UK despite the determination of the government to go ahead.
The locals firmly oppose the initiative. One of the main reasons being that fracking in the Texan prairies is in no way similar to fracking in a densely populated Europe.
Protest has been held in Sherwood Forest against plans to survey for shale gas. Exploration is at an early stage, still in negotiations, but there are fears in the long term it could see fracking of land under or adjacent to the ancient woodland.
They need to do the seismic surveys before they can find out where it's safe to frack, and we're saying it's not safe to frack in this area.
I prefer we were putting money into renewables.
We shouldn't be exploiting any more fossil fuel gas because it's ruining our planet.
Yes, it's ruining our planet, not just because of the water supply, and not just because of the air.
The shale revolution threatens to revive the use of fossil energy. How will this affect all our efforts towards a future based on renewable energy?
Because of this abundance of gas and oil created by the shale revolution, now the incentive to invest in renewable energy will go away. How do you look at this?
I think it is a bridge fuel. I don't think we're going to be living off deriving energy from natural gas forever and ever. I think eventually we are going to reach a point where the technology is there, where renewables are economically viable.
We've seen in the last decade is that the costs have gone down a lot and the scale has increased, and so renewables are clearly going to have a growing share of the energy mix in the years ahead. I think renewables have made a lot of progress and they'll continue to make progress.
Technology advances forward. It's going to eventually get to the point where the battery systems that we have, the transmission systems, the generation systems, either with solar or wind, get to the point where at a price point they can compete with natural gas. And at that point, gas will fade away and renewables will come in. Never bet against technology. We're going to come up with better storage systems, better generation systems, just the same way technology started the shale revolution.
Ultimately, the lowest cost provider wins, and you need to be comfortable and agnostic about that. If wind or solar beats out a natural gas power plant, it doesn't matter how much government regulation or Trump helps or anything along those lines. You're going to lose. Economics wins.
Well, that's fascinating, your formulation. This is all an economic argument. There's an economics wins. Of course, we won't look at the subsidies that we're giving to the fossil fuel industries that taxpayers have been giving for decades. The billions of dollars that have been spent to develop oil and get rights of way to various kinds of pipelines and the like. All of that, well, we don't calculate that into the economics of this. Economics is going to win if political power decides not to do anything, and in fact to reinforce what's available, as the conclusion of their program made very clear. Take a look.
The shale revolution has upset the balance of energy relations across the globe. If the political wind changes following Donald Trump and Brexit, many countries could soon be tempted by the potential economic benefits of shale exploitation. The shale revolution has upset the balance of energy relations across the globe. If the political wind changes following Donald Trump and Brexit, many countries could soon be tempted by the potential economic benefits of shale exploitation.
So, we should listen to that a few times, because the commentator here in the film is basically contradicting the whole point that you just made, namely economics will win. You heard the fellow quoted, well, yeah, we've got to just adjust to that. But she points out, in fact, that it's the politics that could change the access to this technology. And as one government after another in the tradition of Trump gets more and more excited about their energy independence and adopts this new extraction technology, well, it could go in the direction of more and more fossil fuels. Absolutely extraordinary. Listen to the logic. It has nothing to do ultimately with the economics, other than once you've made the political decision to become energy independent, you figure out how to make a profit at it.
The shale revolution has upset the balance of energy relations across the globe. If the political wind changes following Donald Trump and Brexit, many countries could soon be tempted by the potential economic benefits of shale exploitation.
Okay. If the political winds change, many could be tempted by the economic benefits. So the if-then proposition is very clearly, if the political winds change, then the economics will fall into line. Danny's saying pretty much the same thing. He suggests that, of course, the technology will come through for solar and wind and the like, and they'll eventually become competitive. Well, how's that going to happen when subsidies are being given to the tune of tens and hundreds of billions of dollars to their competitors, namely the extractive industries? Not very clear on the economics when you look at that kind of competitive advantage of a whole fossil fuel tradition. Really quite extraordinary and rather depressing, because the winds are changing.
The shale revolution has upset the balance of energy relations across the globe. If the political wind changes following Donald Trump and Brexit, many countries could soon be tempted by the potential economic benefits of shale exploitation.
Well, we don't have to look very far to realize that the political winds have changed, not only in this country, but in Brexit, in Britain, in virtually every European country currently active, and in all of Asia at this point, both in India and in China. We have more authoritarian states making more and more centralized decisions, not moving in a fast pace towards energy self-sufficiency on solar throughput, but energy extraction based on the fossil fuel model. We need to make a transition, but not everyone realizes that, especially those who are talking about the shale revolution. The shale revolution has been hailed as a gift from God under the Trump administration. Fracking under Trump has been hailed as a major breakthrough. But we have to look at this carefully. This is the book by Daniel Yergin that looks at the history of that fracking revolution, the shale revolution. Now, in many respects, the Trump camp definitely regards the fracking revolution as a gift from God because it enabled him to still get support from the fossil fuel lobby well after coal became uneconomic. Although many coal producers have had to go bankrupt, including some of his biggest supporters, like Bob Murray, who helped shape Trump's energy policies, has now gone bankrupt. It's amazing in a way. It's the eclipse of an entire phase of fossil fuels. But the gift from God, the shale revolution, has been regarded as a real breakthrough by those who want to keep fossil fuels alive and well. What's happened is a shift, not so much a gift from God, but a shift from man, from one kind of carbon to another kind of carbon. The question is, how does this relate to climate? Is Danny Yergin going to be able to tell us? Well, it's going to be an interesting case to look at in detail. What does he know about climate? What does he know about carbon's impact on climate? What does he know about the shift in the shale revolution from one form of terrestrial carbon to another form of terrestrial carbon and its effect on climate? Well, the further questions are quite obvious too. What's going to happen to the other forms of renewable energy as fracking has become so important in the shale revolution? Will fracking kill solar, wind, and in fact all renewable energy sources as a competitor in the open marketplace? We need to look at that. Will fracking kill solar, wind, and renewable energy? Perhaps not kill, but indefinitely postpone. We still should ask, what happens if renewable energy is postponed? What happens to the climate if renewable energy is postponed and our increased consumption of fossilized carbon not only continues but expands with this new cheap source of energy. The new map will tell us, this is the title of his new book, but what are we going to expect from it on climate? Well, it'd be nice if it had a thorough cost accounting of what climate impacts are going to be. Perhaps this suggests a new title for Jürgen's next book. As in the past, Jürgen could write essentially the same book yet again. He wrote The Prize in 1991, followed by The Quest. If you look at the subtitles, they're very interesting. The Prize anticipated The Quest because in its subtitle is The Epic Quest for Oil, Money, and Power. In The Quest, we have energy, security, and the remaking of the modern world, right? Over here in the new book, we have energy, climate, and the clash of nations. Very interesting sequence from subtitles. It's as if the subtitles of his previous books give you a clue as to what he's going to write for the next book. This time, he only needs to change the subtitle. He doesn't even need to change the title. We have a new map, in effect, to energy, climate, and the collapse of civilizations. If he's been listening to the energy experts or consulting them in any way, he'll realize that that's what's at stake, the collapse of civilizations. The trouble is that Danny, Jürgen, and all those who embrace his advice and share his perspective on the shale revolution have already written this book, but they don't realize it because they are sleepwalking in the collective trance of the American dream. Let's listen again to the Isaacson-Jürgen interview, which occurred just this past month on Amanpour and Company.
The issues of fracking, emissions, and energy demand preoccupy our next guest. He's Daniel Jürgen. He's a Pulitzer Prize-winning author and an energy expert, and he served as an advisor in the last 4 administrations. His latest book, The New Map, Energy, Climate, and the Clash of Nations, looks at just how it shapes America's position in the world. And here he is talking to our Walter Isaacson about all of this and the most promising new solutions out there.
Thank you, Christian, and Dan Jürgen, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Glad to be with you.
Before we get to the politics of the moment, explain to me what the shale oil revolution is all about and how it's impacted our country.
Walter, you are a student of entrepreneurs and stubborn people who make things happen. And the shale revolution is congruent with that understanding. There was one person in particular who was just convinced for 18 years that you could do this, and people thought it was crazy. He said, "You're wasting your money." He said, "It's my money." It was a public company, but he controlled it. And finally had a breakthrough in the period 1998 to 2003 is when it happened. And it really yoked together 2 technologies because petroleum textbooks had said this was impossible, that you couldn't get oil and gas out of this very dense rock called shale. It turns out you can. And then with this other technology, which depends upon advanced, computer capabilities, basically, you can drill horizontally 2 miles under the earth. Those 2 things are the technologies that brought shale together and turned this area of Texas and New Mexico called the Permian into the great rival of the largest oil field in Saudi Arabia.
You wrote a wonderful book called The Prize, which talked about America's dependence on oil. Suddenly things changed with the shale oil revolution. How has that created what you call the new map of energy?
It's turned things around 180 degrees, where the U.S. used to really worry about energy dependence, importing 60% of its oil. Today, the United States is the world's largest producer of oil, and that's changed economics, it's changed psychology, and it's had a big impact on international relations as well.
Dan Jürgen, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Glad to be with you.
Before we get to the politics of the moment, explain to me what the shale oil revolution is all about and how it's impacted our country.
Walter, you are a student of entrepreneurs and stubborn people who make things happen. And the shale revolution is congruent with that understanding.
Dan Jorgen, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Glad to be with you.
Before we get to the politics of the moment, explain to me what the shale oil revolution is all about and how it's impacted our country.
Walter, you are a student of entrepreneurs and stubborn people who make things happen. And the shale revolution is congruent with that understanding. There was one person in particular who was just convinced for 18 years that you could do this, and people thought it was crazy. He said, "You're wasting your money." He said, "It's my money." It was a public company, but he controlled it. And finally had a breakthrough in the period 1998 to 2003 is when it happened, and it really yoked together two technologies because petroleum textbooks had said this was impossible, that you couldn't get oil and gas out of this very dense rock called shale. It turns out you can. And then with this other technology, which depends upon advanced computer capabilities, basically, you can drill horizontally 2 miles under the earth. Those two things are the technologies that brought shale together and turned this area of Texas and New Mexico called the Permian into the great rival of the largest oil field in Saudi Arabia.
You wrote a wonderful book called The Prize, which talked about America's dependence on oil. Suddenly things changed with the shale oil revolution. How has that created what you call the new map of energy?
It's turned things around 180 degrees, where the U.S. used to really worry about energy dependence, importing 60% of its oil. Today, the United States is the world's largest producer of oil, and that's changed economics, it's changed psychology, and it's had a big impact on international relations as well.
We're witnessing the action of distraction, and it's important to realize this. We need to pay attention here, close attention, not just to the books on his shelf. He's promoting the book. This is quite understandable. Next to it, of course, is The Prize, and then his other books on the quest, and his current book, The New Map. Again, this may not have been his idea, but the publisher's idea that in every interview he should have his book prominently displayed. So we shouldn't blame Danny for this. But we should look at the action of distraction. Note that the interview itself is very pleasant, but the trouble with the interview is that it distracts the viewership from the problems that need to be discussed and diverts their attention away from the really important issues. Question, which was never asked by Walter Isaacson, or for that matter, anyone else who's been interviewing Daniel Jorgen on his new book. Why has there never been an honest cost-benefit analysis of fossil fuel energy as a whole? Sure, fracking makes it possible for the shale revolution, as you call it, to make bonanza profits. But what about a cost-benefit analysis of fossil fuels? Not just the recent revolutionary profit made by fracking. What might an honest cost-benefit analysis look like? What would it have to include? Well, it could start by looking at the extraordinary contrast between record corporate growth and global system collapse. There's been a privatizing of the benefits and an externalizing the costs of world carbon production. We'd have to look at the whole question of the imprecision, shall we say, or the absolute doubt about the survival in the future that's implied by the engineering needed to keep carbon within safe limits in the atmosphere. In effect, the entire fossil fuel industry is betting the world's future and hoping that geoengineering is going to be feasible to make it profitable to continue to use carbon. These are high stakes gambling terms in the age of desperation, but it's not at all clear that we can outlive our capacity to produce, extract, and burn fossilized carbon. We're betting the world's future. That's one of the things that ought to be taken into account in a cost-benefit analysis, the uncertainty of what's coming. Then we ought to look at the carbon cost of free trade, quote unquote free trade. What is the carbon impact of trade agreements like NAFTA or the Trans-Pacific Partnership or the TTIP? These are really never brought into the discussion of carbon. What about the climate damage assessments that need to be done? Assessing the full cost of 40 years of profits, lies, and deception from the fossil fuel industries. We've found out that Exxon knew back in the 1970s that we were facing catastrophic, potentially catastrophic climate alteration because of the emissions of carbon dioxide. And as it turns out, the auto industries knew about that shortly thereafter. But there's been an effort on the part of dark money to keep this denial alive, funded largely by the richest components of the fossil fuel equation, the Koch brothers in the past. How do you start calculating into the costs of carbon the climate damage that's being done as we speak? This report came from October 31st. That is, yesterday. One of the strongest storms ever, Super Typhoon Goni, strikes Philippines with 195 mile per hour winds. Staggering. And there's more to come. What would the equation look like if we started to look at water and the cost of fracking to this most precious resource for life? What we're beginning to realize in detail is that it's oil or water. The high cost of cheap energy fuels are cheap in only one sense, and that is if you regard life as cheap. Then we have to deal with this whole question of time horizon. How do the best and the brightest get suckered into thinking about profits beyond the quarterly report, beyond the annual report, over decades, over centuries? Or do they just ignore that, saying, we have no way to predict it, so we won't take it into account? This is a tragic form of myopia on the part of the best and the brightest who have promoted growthism and its constant pattern of overshoot and collapse. What about the moral betrayal of our children? Who's going to be looking at the reckoning in cost-benefit terms of denying a future generation its capacity to live, let alone prosper? So we need to look at the action of distraction carefully. The full cost of this kind of distraction is staggering. The fossil fuel corporations have reaped the benefits, but externalized the true costs of their operation onto the world at large. This has been made clear at the UN.
We're facing the fact that we've done cost-benefit analysis and looked only at the benefits, not looked at the costs. The whole carbon bubble, the carbon moment in human history, is one great big gaspillage of a resource with no cost accounted for in terms of its impact on a global functioning ecosystem. If those costs were internalized, you'd be paying $57 a gallon for gas, right? So, yeah, we got to get the metrics straight, but we also just have to move off of carbon. Not because it's becoming more scarce. A few years ago, we used to think, and on one of the graphs I used, it was the peak oil question that was the great anxiety. We're going to run out of the stuff. Well, in fact, we're not going to run out of fossil fuels in any known future, especially with the new technologies used in fracking and the like. It's not the scarcity of the material, it's the impact of the material. We can't survive using that amount of carbon. Just on the post-Columbian city basis. Post-Columbian cities are those that were put in place after Columbus discovered, as it were, the New World. He didn't discover it because it wasn't lost, right? But in any case, the post-Columbian city was put in place, pretty much, at sea level. Because that's how he got here, right? On a boat. The post-Columbian city is under challenge. If you didn't see the graphic here, 1,400 cities in the United States alone. We can't survive in those cities with the combustion of terrestrial carbon. This is why the new movement that's emerging is called the carbon underground. We're trying to keep the carbon underground. And you start doing the metric for that, you measure progress in a very different way. Not how much carbon have you used, but how much have you sequestered? How much have you prevented from being used? Second point about other alternative energies, use the renewable ones. Don't fall into the trap of thinking that nuclear is a solution to anything. If you want to look at externalized costs, think about the tens of thousands of years of the waste products that you have to deal with. We don't even have human languages that have persisted long enough to label this stuff. Right? There used to be a department within the DoD, the Department of Defense in the United States, which is actually trying to think of symbol systems to put on nuclear waste dumps so that people would know after a nuclear exchange had occurred to stay away from this material because it was lethal, because the languages wouldn't be around anymore, right? We can't cope with the downstream impact of nuclear, let alone the downstream impact of carbon. So don't think nuclear is the solution in this. What you got to do is run the whole thing on the solar throughput. Now that means water, wind, tidal, micro, hydro, and the like. That is, hydro is a function of the water cycle, and you're placing yourself back into a solar-driven system. But the only, see, we've got the thing 180 degrees around. We think we live on a planet with infinite resources and finite energy. We're struggling over to control that finite energy. In fact, in America, it's so absurd. We think that the world doesn't quite get it. That's our oil in the Middle East, right? It's just a geologic mistake it's in the Middle East. But it's our oil. And we spend a few $1 billion a day sort of making sure the world understands that. It's our oil. We're on the wrong metaphor in the sense that it's not infinite energy that we have moved to, and we need to. The infinite throughput of solar energy. We're thinking we've got finite energy and infinite resources, whereas in fact we have finite resources and infinite energy. So this isn't just a slight correction in metric here and there. It's a compass question. Are we going in the right direction? Not, are we becoming more efficient in the direction in which we're going? All you'll do with that is sort of make extinction more efficient, which really isn't the goal.
No, extinction really isn't the goal. This shouldn't have to be pointed out. It doesn't matter how efficient we become in the process if the direction is still moving towards extinction. It is, after all, a compass question, not a speedometer question. So we need to remobilize our metrics to measure different kinds of things. Tragically, however, this is where humanity is now headed, toward extinction. If we continue to fuel our civilization through the combustion of terrestrial carbon, whether it's coal or petroleum or what's called natural gas, we're in real trouble. In fact, we are collectively sleepwalking to the end of the earth. The tragic irony is that there is no excuse for this. Many of these political and thought leaders have had access to the world's best educational institutions. Both George W. Bush and Daniel Yergin were members of the class of 1968 at Yale, and they benefited from that education. In fact, for the Yale 68 35th reunion, President Bush invited the whole class to the White House. It was quite a celebration. The President and Mrs. Bush request the pleasure of your company at a picnic dinner in celebration of the 35th reunion of Yale 68. This was back in May 29, 2003. The day after that reception at the White House, back in New Haven, the Reverend William Sloane Coffin gave a memorable speech to the class of 1968. In fact, it was so memorable that it became a movie. It was made into a movie by one of the members of the class of 1968, Lloyd Kaufman. Fantastic movie entitled Splendor and Wisdom. And by the 40th reunion, 5 years later, everyone in the class received a copy of the movie, thanks to Lloyd Kaufman's generosity. It's an amazing documentary. Further, at that gathering on the 40th, there were several panels that looked at this whole question of transition beyond fossil fuels. As you can see, one of them was entitled in the left-hand column, Carbon Energy, Climate Change, and the Future of the Human Prospect. The reason why I know that is that I was asked to chair the panel, and I did. It was fascinating. And Daniel Yergin was invited to be a member of that panel. He couldn't attend, though, because he was giving advice to President Putin at the time. Instead, we heard from Thomas Kuhn, president of Edison Electric Institute, quite an energy expert. We also heard from Eugene Linden, an investigative journalist and author whose writings on climate change are really quite riveting. Finally, we heard from James Gustav Speth, known as Gus Speth, who was the dean at the time of the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies. A staggering career of action on several fronts in all of the environmental movement, but particularly on climate issues. He had just published and talked about his important book called The Bridge at the Edge of the World, Capitalism, the Environment, and Crossing from Crisis to Sustainability. He went on later to do a number of things, including standing strong with Bill McKibben outside the White House and getting himself elected to several distinguished chairs, but at the same time, getting himself arrested. for that demonstration against the pipeline. He's then gone on to talk about ecology, economics, and ethics, specifically highlighting the fact that we need to move beyond short-term economic calculation and examine the ethical implications of continued use of carbon. Unfortunately, President Bush missed all the panel discussions in the New Haven part of the 35th reunion and skipped the 40th reunion entirely. For the 50th reunion in 2018, President Bush and his wife flew up from Texas to New Haven to be a featured speaker. Which one is Tweedledum? Which Tweedledee? Which is he? Well, we know he's an energy expert. But we need to look more carefully at how, by following delusional politicians and short-sighted energy consultants, Americans are now sleepwalking toward the end of the earth. Even if we have a new map, the question is, can we sleepwalk with this new map? We're told it's a book about energy, climate, and the clash of nations. But it might be helpful to retitle it as the Energy, Climate, and Collapse of Civilizations book. We know that Daniel is an expert on energy. But what about climate and the collapse of civilizations? There's a lot more to be discussed here and learned.